Eliot shifted uncomfortably in the old, creaky house. The storm outside raged with a fury that seemed almost personal, battering against the windows like a desperate soul trying to break in. Mara sat by the fire, staring at the flames, her face eerily blank. It had been 3 days since the strange incident at the antique store, 3 days since she'd touched that mirror. "Do you think it's cursed?" Eliot's voice broke the heavy silence, his words more a nervous joke than a genuine question. Mara didn't respond. She hadn't said much since that day. Her once warm, teasing smile had vanished, replaced by an unsettling detachment. "Mara?" he called again, his voice laced with concern. She finally turned to him, her movement slow and deliberate. Her eyes caught the flicker of the firelight, but something about them seemed off. Darker, deeper. "You talk too much, Eliot," she said softly, her voice low, almost guttural. Eliot froze. It wasn't her voice, not really. It carried an edge, a coldness he had never heard before. "Are you feeling okay?" "Maybe we should see a doctor." "No doctors!" Mara snapped, standing abruptly. The fire roared as if in response, its flames shooting higher and casting twisted shadows on the walls. Eliot took a cautious step back. "Mara, you're scaring me." She tilted her head, the corners of her lips curling into a smile that was anything but comforting. "Am I?" That night, Eliot couldn't sleep. Mara had retreated to their bedroom without another word, leaving him alone with his spiraling thoughts. The mirror had been strange, covered in ancient runes and giving off an unnerving sense of wrongness, but he'd dismissed it as an antique shop gimmick. Mara, however, had seemed drawn to it, her fingers lingering on its ornate frame, despite the shopkeeper's warnings. "He shouldn't have touched it," the man had muttered almost to himself. A loud thud from upstairs jolted Eliot out of his reverie. Heart pounding, he rushed up the creaky stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. "Mara?" he called, his voice trembling. The door to their bedroom was ajar, and a chilling draft seeped through the opening. He pushed it open cautiously, his breath hitching at what he saw. Mira stood in front of the window, her back to him, whispering something in a language Eliot couldn't recognize. The wind outside howled as if answering her words. "Their fighting still spouts flames and small dragons," Eliot said. "Mira, what are you doing?" She didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head slightly to the side, as though she'd heard him but didn't care enough to answer. Her reflection in the glass didn't match her movements. Eliot's blood ran cold. The Mara in the reflection was smiling, wide and malicious, her teeth unnaturally sharp. "Mara!" he shouted, stepping forward and grabbing her shoulder. She spun around, her face a mask of fury. Her eyes weren't her own. They were pitch black, endless voids that seemed to swallow the dim light of the room. Eliot stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. "Don't touch me," she hissed, her voice layered as though someone or something else was speaking alongside her. Before Eliot could respond, the bedroom door slammed shut on its own, plunging him into darkness. He could hear Mara laughing, a low, sinister sound that chilled him to his core. Eliot woke the next morning on the floor of the hallway, his head pounding. The events of the previous night felt like a fever dream, but the claw marks on the bedroom door told him otherwise. He opened the door slowly, bracing himself for what he might find. "How do you know that?" he asked, bracing himself for what he might find. Mara sat on the edge of the bed, her hair disheveled, her face pale. She looked up at him, her eyes back to normal, filled with confusion and fear. "Eliot, what happened?" He hesitated. "You don't remember?" She shook her head, tears welling up. I felt like I wasn't myself, like something was inside me." She sighed heavily. Eliot's stomach turned. He couldn't bring himself to tell her about the black eyes, the sinister laughter, or the reflection. "Maybe you're just exhausted," he lied, forcing a smile. "We'll figure this out." But Eliot knew this was no ordinary exhaustion. That afternoon, he called Jonas, his oldest friend. "She's acting strange, Jonas. It's like she's someone else." "Possession?" Jonas joked, but Eliot didn't laugh. "Do you think that's possible?" Jonas's tone shifted. "You're serious?" "Look, if you think something's really wrong, there's someone I know. Her name's Celine. She's unconventional, but she might be able to help." Desperate, Eliot agreed. Celine arrived that evening, a woman with piercing gray eyes and an aura of calm authority. She carried a small bag of herbs, crystals, and other mysterious items. "This is not a normal case," Celine said after listening to Eliot's account. "Whatever touched her through that mirror wasn't human." "Can you fix it?" Eliot asked, his voice trembling. Celine's gaze darkened. "I can try, but you must be prepared for what we might uncover." As the three of them gathered in the living room, Mara's demeanor shifted again. She smiled at Celine, her eyes glinting with malice. "Finally," Mara said, her voice not her own. "Someone interesting." Eliot's heart sank. Celine stood her ground. "You are not welcome here. Release her." Mara laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally. "She invited me. She's mine now." The lights flickered, and a deafening roar filled the room. The room fell deathly silent after the roar subsided, the only sound the faint crackle of the fireplace. Eliot stood frozen, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst. Mara, or the thing inhabiting her, was smiling, her head tilted unnaturally, her dark eyes fixed on Celine. Celine was looking directly at him, her dark eyes fixed on Celine. "Who are you?" Celine demanded, her voice steady despite the palpable tension in the air. Mara's head snapped toward her with an audible crack. "Who I am is irrelevant. What matters is that this body is mine now." "No," Eliot whispered, stepping forward. "You're not taking her." Mara's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment Eliot thought he saw the faintest hint of his wife's true self, the Mara he knew and loved. But the darkness returned almost instantly, swallowing the flicker of light. Celine pulled a bundle of herbs from her bag, lighting it with a match. The sharp, earthy scent of sage filled the air as she began to chant in a language Eliot couldn't understand. Celine, and Eliot couldn't understand, found deliverance while waiting for the rest of the covenant to arrive. The entity inside Mara snarled, recoiling slightly. "You think that will stop me?" It hissed, its voice layered with something ancient and malevolent. It spun faster and faster until it became a... Celine's chant grew louder, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost crept along the edges of the windows, and the flames in the fireplace dimmed. Eliot could see his breath fogging in the icy air. Mara lunged at Celine, her movements impossibly fast. Eliot barely had time to react, grabbing her around the waist and pulling her back. But she was unnaturally strong, throwing him across the room like a rag doll. He crashed into the bookshelf, books and trinkets raining down on him as pain shot through his body. "Eliot!" Celine shouted, her voice breaking for the first time. Mara turned back to Celine, her smile widening. "You can't save her. She invited me, and I will not leave willingly." Celine's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll force you out." She threw a handful of salt toward Mara, and the reaction was immediate. Mara screamed, a blood-curdling sound that seemed to shake the very walls. Her body convulsed, the veins in her neck and arms turning black as if something dark was crawling beneath her skin. "Mara!" Eliot cried, struggling to his feet. "She's fighting," Celine said, her voice urgent. "But the entity is strong. Eliot, you need to help me." "What do I do?" he asked, his voice cracking with desperation. talk to her, remind her of who she is. She's the key. We can't expel the entity unless she pushes back. Eliot stumbled toward Mara, his vision blurred with tears. She was on her knees now, trembling violently, her hands clawing at the floor. "Morrow!" he shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. "It's me. It's Eliot. You have to fight this." She looked up at him, her eyes flickering between black and their usual warm hazel. For a moment, it was her. "Eliot," she whispered, her voice fragile. "Yes," she whispered, her voice fragile. "Eliot?" "I'm here," he said, grabbing her hands. "Remember us. Remember our life together. The hikes, the late-night talks, the stupid songs we made up. Remember how much I love you." Tears streamed down her face, but the darkness in her eyes surged again, stronger this time. "It's too strong," she choked out. I can't." "Yes, you can," Eliot yelled, shaking her gently. "You're stronger than this thing. You're stronger than anything. Fight it, Mara." Celine stepped closer, her voice rising in a commanding chant. The room shook violently. Picture frames falling from the walls, the furniture scraping across the floor as if dragged by invisible hands. Mara screamed again, her body writhing. The darkness seemed to leak from her eyes, her mouth, her very pores, cooling around her like a living shadow. It lashed out at Eliot and Celine, cold tendrils of malice trying to push them back. Celine threw another handful of salt into the shadow, her voice unwavering despite the chaos. "Eliot, she's almost there. Keep going." "Mara, I need you," Eliot shouted, his voice breaking. "I can't lose you, not like this." The shadows writhed, twisting violently as Mara let out an ear-piercing scream. Her eyes turned fully black for one terrifying moment before the darkness exploded outward, shattering the windows and extinguishing every light in the house. Minutes later, the door slammed open behind them and the two women dropped their positions. Minutes later, they were up and running, shooting violently as they ran up the stairs, dragging the woman along. Ben. Silence. Eliot scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking. "Mira?" he called into the darkness. The faint glow of the streetlights outside illuminated her crumpled form on the floor. He rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms. "Mara?" he whispered, his heart racing. Her eyes fluttered open, hazel once more. She looked at him with tears streaming down her face. "Eliot? Is it gone?" Before he could answer, a low growl echoed from the corner of the room. Celine turned sharply, her face pale. "It's not over," she said, her voice barely audible. From the shadows, a figure began to emerge. It was humanoid but twisted, its limbs too long, its face featureless save for two glowing red eyes. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It had been set free. Evandine was prepared. He had spent days and days preparing for the meeting, and his travel plan had been set free. "You made a mistake," it rasped, its voice filling the room like nails scraping against glass. Eliot pulled Mara behind him as Celine stepped forward, her hands trembling but her resolve firm. "Eliot, take Mara and run," she said. "No," Eliot said firmly, "I'm not leaving you." Celine turned to him, her eyes fierce. "You don't have a choice. I'll hold it off, but you need to get her as far away as possible. Go." The entity lunged, its movements unnaturally fast. Celine threw up her hands, a barrier of light momentarily halting its advance. "Go!" she screamed again. Eliot grabbed Mara, pulling her to her feet. They stumbled out of the house, the sounds of Celine's chants and the entity's roars following them into the night. As they reached the street, the house behind them erupted in flames, a horrifying roar echoing through the neighborhood. Eliot held Mara close, tears streaming down his face as they watched the fire consume their home and the nightmare within. Weeks later, Eliot and Mara sat in a small motel room, their lives reduced to the essentials they had managed to grab in their frantic escape. Mara was recovering slowly, but neither of them spoke much about what had happened. Eliot tried to distract Mara by telling her stories, which he tried to keep fresh, but neither of them spoke much about what had happened. One night, as Eliot sat by the window, staring out at the stars, Mara's voice broke the silence. "Do you think it's really gone?" But as he turned back to the window, his reflection in the glass didn't match his movements. And behind him, Mara's smile was just a little too wide.